You will probably die in a room you've never seen before. A hospital room, most likely. White walls. A curtain. Machines making sounds you don't understand, operated by people you met a few days ago. Statistically, that's where it happens now. Not at home. Not surrounded by everyone you love. Behind a curtain, on a schedule, managed by professionals. Now here's the part that should stop you. Every single human being who lived before roughly the last 100 years died differently. They died at home. They died in front of children. They died with the smell of the cooking fire still in the room. Death was not hidden. It was not outsourced. It was furniture. And here's the paradox, that this entire video is going to sit inside. We have painkillers they never had. We have life expectancy nearly double theirs. We have grief counselors, therapy apps, hospice care, funeral planners who handle every detail so we don't have to. We have done everything humanly possible to protect ourselves from death. And yet, by almost every psychological measure we are more afraid of it than they ever were. So today we're asking an uncomfortable question. Not how did ancient humans survive death? We've covered that. The question is, how did they survive knowing about it? How did people who buried children, who watched a third of their infants die before age 5, who lost people constantly, avoid the crushing, paralyzing dread that modern psychologists now have a clinical name for? And what did we lose exactly when we built a civilization specifically designed to make death invisible? Let's start with the diagnosis, because this isn't just a feeling. It's a documented, measurable condition. Psychologists call it Thanatophobia, an excessive, often disabling fear of death or the dying process. But you don't need the clinical label to recognize it. It shows up as the person who can't visit a dying relative, the person who avoids hospitals entirely, even for checkups, the person who has a full-blown panic attack at 35 because they felt a strange heartbeat. We've built an entire economy around not thinking about this. Anti-aging creams, longevity supplements, cryogenic freezing companies that will, for a fee, store your corpse in the hope that future science reverses the one outcome every organism that has ever lived has experienced without exception. We are, as a species, spending unprecedented resources trying to negotiate with something that has never once accepted a negotiation. Here's the twist that should genuinely bother you. Researchers studying death anxiety across cultures have found something almost backwards from what you'd expect. Populations with the least exposure to death in daily life, modern, industrialized, medically advanced societies, report the highest levels of death anxiety. Populations that live closest to death, that see it regularly, that handle bodies with their own hands, report significantly lower levels of the same fear. That's not a coincidence, and it's not a personality quirk of ancient people being tougher than us. It's a mechanism, a specific, identifiable psychological mechanism that modern life has quietly dismantled. And to understand it, we need to go back to a fire, a hut, and a corpse that everyone in the group would have personally touched. So what exactly did ancient humans know about managing this fear that we somehow unlearned? The answer starts with something researchers call terror management, and it explains almost everything that follows in this video. In the 1980s, a group of psychologists built a framework that's become one of the most tested ideas in modern social psychology. It's called terror management theory, and the core idea is almost embarrassingly simple once you hear it. Human beings are the only animal, as far as we know, that fully understands it's going to die. Not just in the moment of danger. A gazelle knows fear when a lion is chasing it, but abstractly, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, with no threat present at all. That awareness, sitting quietly in the background of every human mind, creates a constant low-grade psychological pressure. Left unmanaged, it would be paralyzing. You cannot function, hunt, plan, raise children, build anything, if you are consciously dreading your own extinction every waking hour. So the human mind evolved a buffer system, and that buffer is meaning. Specifically, terror management theory argues that we protect ourselves from death anxiety through two things: a cultural worldview that gives life significance beyond our individual body, and self-esteem, the sense that we are living up to the values of that worldview. Believe strongly that you're part of something larger, a tribe, a lineage, a cosmology, an afterlife, a legacy, and the terror of personal extinction gets absorbed into something that doesn't end when you do. Here's where it gets interesting for our purposes. Terror management theory has been tested in hundreds of experiments, and one of the most consistent findings is this: when people are reminded of their own death, they cling harder to their cultural worldview. They favor their in-group more strongly. They seek meaning more urgently. Death reminders don't just cause fear, they cause a search for structure. Now think about what ancient death rituals actually were, functionally. They weren't superstition for its own sake. They were the single most efficient terror management technology a Stone Age brain could access. Every funeral rite, every myth about an afterlife, every ancestor cult was, whether anyone understood it this way or not, a structured psychological defense system, built collectively, reinforced by the entire group, deployed every single time death occurred. But here's the uncomfortable question this raises. If ritual was the defense mechanism, what happens to a species when it stops performing the ritual? We're about to find out, because that's almost exactly what modern industrialized society did. Let's get concrete about what constant exposure to death actually meant in a pre-modern life, because the scale of it is genuinely hard for a modern brain to absorb. Historical demographic estimates suggest that in most pre-industrial populations, somewhere between a quarter and half of all children born did not survive to age 5. Maternal mortality, as we've covered in a previous video, sat around 1 to 2% per birth, a real recurring risk across a woman's reproductive life. This means the average adult in a pre-modern community had, by the time they reached their 30s, personally witnessed death dozens of times. Siblings, cousins, their own children, in many tragic cases, elderly relatives, hunting accidents, childbirth, infection from a wound that today would be treated with a $5 course of antibiotics. Death wasn't an occasional visitor. It was a recurring character in the story of an ordinary life. And critically, this is the part that changes everything. Death was not managed by strangers. There were no morticians, no funeral directors, no hospital staff whose job it was to handle the body so the family didn't have to. The family washed the body. The family wrapped it. In many documented traditional cultures, close relatives dug the grave with their own hands, sat with the corpse for a specified mourning period, and performed the burial rites themselves, together, in full view of children. Children specifically were not shielded from this. In most documented traditional societies, children attended funerals, watched the preparation of bodies, and were present during mourning rituals from a young age. This wasn't cruelty or a lack of protective instinct. It was, functionally, a form of gradual psychological inoculation. Repeated, structured, socially supported exposure to death, the exact opposite of the sudden, unprepared, isolated encounters that define modern death exposure when it does happen. Compare that to a modern child's typical first encounter with death. Often it's sudden, often it's hidden. The pet went to live on a farm. Grandma went to sleep. The body is embalmed, cosmetically altered, and displayed for a few controlled hours in a room designed specifically to feel unlike anywhere else in that child's life. Then, it disappears from view entirely, into a system the child never sees again. The exposure is minimal, unstructured, and often deliberately softened into euphemism. So we've established that ancient humans saw death constantly and handled it directly. But seeing something is only half the story. The other half is what they did with what they saw, and this is where the ritual technology gets genuinely sophisticated. If terror management theory tells us why ritual works, the archaeological and anthropological record tells us how ancient cultures actually built it. And the diversity here is remarkable, because while the specifics vary enormously, the underlying function is almost identical everywhere researchers have looked. Take excarnation, sometimes called sky burial, practiced historically in parts of Tibet, Mongolia, and among Zoroastrian communities in Persia. The body is deliberately exposed to open air and scavenging birds rather than buried or burned. To a modern sensibility, this can sound shocking, but within its cultural framework, it carried a specific psychological function: the visible, active return of the body to the natural world, witnessed by the community, transforming an abstract idea, we return to nature, into a literal, observable event. Now compare that to ancient Egyptian practice at the opposite extreme: mummification, an elaborate, resource-intensive process specifically designed to preserve the body as close to its living form as possible, paired with an enormously detailed belief system about a continued existence after death. These look like opposites. One releases the body to nature immediately, the other preserves it indefinitely, but functionally, they're solving the exact same psychological problem from two different angles. Both provide a structured, detailed, culturally reinforced narrative about what happens next. Both eliminate the single most anxiety-producing condition a human mind can face: uncertainty with no framework at all. And then there's the mourning period itself, something documented across an enormous range of traditional cultures, from Jewish Shiva, 7 days of structured communal mourning, to extended multi-week or multi-month mourning periods in various African, Pacific Islander, and indigenous American traditions. These weren't arbitrary customs. They were, in effect, scheduled psychological processing time, built into the social calendar. This is the detail modern grief researchers keep circling back to. Grief handled in isolation, without structured social support, without a clear cultural script for what to do and how long to do it, tends to produce significantly worse psychological outcomes. Here's a question almost nobody asks, though. Did every ancient culture handle this equally well? Or were some traditional approaches to death actually more psychologically effective than others? The comparative evidence gives a surprisingly clear answer. It's tempting, at this point in the video, to romanticize the past entirely, to say ancient death culture was simply wiser and modern death culture is simply broken. That would be a comfortable conclusion, but it isn't an honest one. So the honest picture isn't ancient good, modern bad. It's more specific than that. The traditional death practices that appear, across the comparative record, to have produced the healthiest psychological outcomes shared a specific combination of features: communal presence rather than isolation, a clear and detailed cultural narrative rather than uncertainty, active participation rather than passive spectating, and a defined but not indefinite mourning period, with an actual endpoint. Modern industrialized death culture, when you measure it against that same checklist, fails on almost every point simultaneously. Isolation instead of presence, uncertainty instead of narrative, passive spectating instead of participation, and no defined endpoint. So, if we've essentially removed every structural element that made death psychologically survivable for hundreds of thousands of years, what exactly replaced it? The answer is one of the strangest cultural shifts in the entire history of our species, and it happened astonishingly fast. The disappearance of death from ordinary life is a genuinely recent phenomenon, and the timeline is worth sitting with. As late as the early 20th century, in most industrialized countries, the majority of deaths still occurred at home. Bodies were still typically washed and prepared by family members. Wakes were still commonly held in the family's own front room. Several converging forces pushed death out of the home within the span of roughly 2 or 3 generations. The rise of the modern hospital as the default site of serious illness, the professionalization of the funeral industry, and a broader cultural shift toward what sociologists have called the denial of death, a cultural pattern of increasingly treating death as something to be managed out of sight. Here's the part that connects directly back to terror management theory. Remember, the theory predicts that reminders of death drive people toward meaning-seeking and cultural structure. But what happens when a culture systematically removes the reminders and fails to replace the shared meaning structures that used to accompany them? You get a population that experiences death rarely enough that each individual encounter feels like a unique catastrophe, rather than a recognized part of a shared human pattern. This is, in essence, the mechanism behind the finding we open this chapter with: lower death exposure correlating with higher death anxiety. It's not that seeing death less makes people naturally calmer about it, the way you might assume. It's closer to the opposite. And this is where it gets genuinely strange, because researchers didn't just theorize this shift, they went looking for populations today who still live closer to the older pattern to see if the theory holds up in the real world. What they found is remarkable. Cross-cultural psychological research comparing death anxiety across different modern societies has consistently found lower reported death anxiety in populations with stronger religious or cosmological frameworks, more communal end-of-life care traditions, and greater everyday visibility of death and aging within extended family structures. Hospice care research offers a particularly striking parallel. Modern hospice models, which deliberately reintroduce several ancient elements, consistently report better psychological outcomes for both patients and surviving family members, compared to more conventional, highly medicalized end-of-life management. In effect, modern hospice movements independently rediscovered, through clinical trial and patient outcome research, several of the exact structural principles that traditional death cultures had already encoded into ritual for tens of thousands of years. Grief support research shows a similar pattern. Structured, communal grief support is consistently associated with lower rates of complicated or prolonged grief compared to unsupported, isolated mourning. Modern clinical psychology, in other words, is in the process of quietly re-engineering exactly the social technology that ancient death cultures had already perfected purely through trial, error, and generational transmission. So, if the evidence, this clearly points toward what worked, the obvious question becomes, can any of it actually be recovered inside a modern life? Or is this pattern simply gone for good, a casualty of how we now live. That's worth closing on, honestly. It would be dishonest to end this video suggesting we should abandon modern medicine, modern pain management, or the genuine, extraordinary gift of a life expectancy nearly double what most of human history experienced. That's not the argument. The argument is narrower and, honestly, more useful. The specific psychological technology ancient humans built around death, presence, participation, structured mourning, shared narrative, communal support, was never actually dependent on the absence of modern medicine. It's a separate system entirely, a social and psychological one, that we didn't need to lose in order to gain everything else we've gained. And there's real evidence that some of it is already quietly returning. The modern hospice movement, green burial and home funeral movements, death doulas, a role that's expanded significantly in recent years, functioning in a way that echoes the ancient midwife role we covered in an earlier video, not managing death from a clinical distance, but being with the dying and their families through the process itself. None of this requires abandoning modern comfort or modern medicine. It requires something much simpler and much harder at the same time, choosing, deliberately, to stop treating death as something to be hidden from children, delegated entirely to professionals, and processed alone on a tight schedule. The ancient toolkit wasn't primitive superstition standing in for medicine we didn't have yet. It was a genuinely sophisticated psychological support system, solving a problem that modern life never actually solved. It just stopped looking at it. Go back to the woman on the mat by the fire from the beginning of this video. She wasn't calm about death because her life was easier than yours. It almost certainly wasn't. She was calm, relatively, because for her entire life, death had a shape. It had people around it. It had a story that came after it, told by everyone she trusted, rehearsed since childhood, reinforced every single time it happened. She wasn't managing death alone in a curtained room. She was never managing it alone at all. That's the actual inheritance we quietly set down somewhere in the last 100 years. Not a belief system, not a specific ritual, but a working technology for facing the one thing every single person watching this video has in common with every human who has ever lived. We didn't get worse at dying because we got smarter. We got worse at it because we stopped practicing, stopped showing up, and stopped teaching each other how. 3 things that cost nothing, and that nothing in modern medicine actually prevents us from doing again. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content, covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus, an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside.